Yama. My name is Marley Silver. I'm a proud Aboriginal woman from the Gamilaroi and Dunghutti tribes of New South Wales. On behalf of the Imperfects podcast, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the country on which this podcast is created, and in this, honour the ways in which their elders, past and present, have cared for and nurtured their lands and waterways for millennia. I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people connected to each of the hundreds of countries that make up the continent of so-called Australia, and any of my brothers and sisters listening to this episode. I pay my respects to our leaders and knowledge keepers past and present. I find strength in our survival for over 60,000 years and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Always was, always will be.
Hello, I'm Sir London Fergie III, and welcome to the Academy of Imperfection, where experts in their field share their wisdom on the subject of imperfection. Today, we welcome Indian-born Australian writer and gender equality and mental health advocate, Tarang Chawla.
In the moment, the most supportive thing we can do is actually just say, like, I believe you and I hear you and I'm here for you. What do you need? It would be better if more men in particular listened to the voices and stories of women.
So press pause on Bridget Jones' To the Edge of Reason and listen in to the utterly brilliant Tarang Chawla.
Hello, everyone. We're back in one of our favourite places, a place of learning, of education, of guest lecturers, the Academy of Imperfection. Hugh, this is, it's nice. It always feels nice. It's a warm feeling to be back in here. How do you feel?
Well, I think this is a really special episode and a really important episode for us and all our listeners. So I feel very good about this one.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to be doing this one. I just love that song so much.
Yeah, I know you have a real affinity with that song. I mean, it's a free track. I can send it to you. You can use it as much as you want and never have to pay for it.
Well, you vote for it in Triple Jo's Hottest 100.
Well, after this year, there is a chance. You never know. You never know. Let's please introduce today's lecturer, Hugh.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have Tarang Chawla join us in the Academy of Imperfection for today. I'm going to read your bio out if you don't mind, if that's okay.
Please don't.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, okay.
Will you go against our guest wishes straight up?
No, you know why? I don't know what it says, but I've won a couple of awards and it's really cringeworthy hearing that because it's like, you know, like if you do the work that I do, which I'm sure we'll talk about, you don't really, the awards are kind of secondary, right? You don't do it for that. So like, yeah, it's cringe. But I mean, you have to do it, so do what you got to do.
I wish I could relate to that feeling of the awards being secondary. But, you know, if it makes you feel better, I can mention my awards as well, just to balance things out.
Please.
Okay, so Tarang Chawla is a writer, speaker, anti-violence campaigner and mental health advocate. Tarang founded the Not One More Niki movement, Australia's largest campaign to end violence against women in culturally diverse communities. Tarang came to Australia with his parents from India in 1988 with 2 suitcases and $100. In 2017, Tarang was Young Australian of the Year finalist. Tarang was presented with a Community Champion Award from the Carlton Blues Foundation in a ceremony held at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. In 2019, Pro Bono Australia named Tarang in their top 25 most influential people working for social change. Since 2016, Tarang has been a founding board member of the Victorian Government's Victims Survivors Advisory Council, advising the Victorian Government on the rollout of the Royal Commission into Family Violence Recommendation. So you're a very busy person.
That's good. Yeah, that's enough.
You happy? Because there's more, but I feel like you're getting awkward. So.
No, yeah, it is. I mean, I'm literally here, and it's like third person talking about the like. There's no scenario in which that feels normal. That Hugh Van Cuylenberg is what Yeah, it's like I'm here. I'm right. Thing. Yeah, I'm right here. Like we could talk about it.
Yeah.
But thanks for having me on. It's good to be here. That music at the start, the royalty-free music, is sublime.
Isn't it beautiful?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, Tarang, we do feel very, very, very honoured to have you on the podcast. I listened to the first episode of your new podcast, which is called No Place Like Home.
Yeah, there's no place like home.
There's no place like home, sorry. And it is so incredibly well made for starters, but just so informative and so helpful. It was so helpful to me to understand from a first-person perspective, like guided by you. I really, really recommend it to anyone, because as I'm sure we're about to find out, this spreads far and wide, this issue.
Yeah.
And I think people have an assumption of what this is and what the signs are. And I think what the podcast and what you're doing really showed me, at least, is like, it's much more than we think.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you, Ryan. Thank you. And like, we can name it. Like, we always talk about stuff like the issue, but we can say like domestic abuse, family violence, violence against women, violence against children, violence against men. We can actually like name those issues. I think sometimes we'll as a community, we'll just want to, like, whether it's mental health or something, we'll just try to like shield
Soften
ourselves from it and soften it. But
Yeah.
it's like, actually saying it is one of the first ways to have an open, honest conversation. Is probably one of the first ways to understand the scope and scale of any issue or any problem, so that we can actually do something about it. I think, and there's no need to, particularly for blokes, there's no need to be shying away from having these conversations around these issues.
Because there is like so many things we talk about on this podcast, there is a stigma around talking about it. It feels dangerous to even talk about it, which is so ironic considering what domestic abuse is. But Hugh, I know you wanted to ask Tarang.
Well, I do a lot of talks at schools and I talk about empathy a lot. And when I'm talking about empathy, I just mention that this plays a part in there's a small part where I talk about domestic violence, and this is to a group of teachers. And I was at a school yesterday, and there would have been about probably 50 teachers there. And the second I said domestic violence, there were 4 women in the audience who just dropped their heads straight away. Like they just dropped, and there was a couple of women who kind of looked over their shoulder to see if they're okay. And so I was thinking about it. I've seen this over the last 10 years. Whenever I just say domestic violence, there's just a few heads that just drop.
Yeah,
and I talk about pretty intense mental health stuff, but people will sit through that, and you can tell it's hard for some of them. But I see it all the time. Women just sort of drop their heads because it's just them, and it just hits them so hard.
Yeah.
But I guess what I wanted to do, perhaps if it's okay with you, I know it might be a reasonably heavy place to start, but I think people might be wondering, why have you chosen this line of, I think work's the wrong word, but why do you do what you do?
Yeah, no, it's a perfectly reasonable question. I think, particularly we have to put into context as well, like when you're talking about those women, those 4 women that you saw drop their heads, right? And this is, and we touch on in the podcast, that there is a gendered, aspect to this issue, that regardless of like the gender of any victim of abuse or violence, it's usually a male perpetrator, especially when it comes to physical abuse and violence, right? So we're 4 men sitting around a table talking about this, right? And it's kind of like, I think in one way it's a really good thing that we're having that conversation, but it's also important that we acknowledge that we are 4 men talking about what is an issue that primarily in Australia and globally affects women more than men. So I came to do this work, to do this activism, advocacy, whatever you want to call it, a little over 7 years ago now. So when, you're talking about in the bio that, my family, we moved here when I was 18 months of age, and, a couple of suitcases, some old paper money. And then 3 years after that, my parents, my mum gave birth to my little sister, Niki. And in many ways, like coming from that migrant background, Niki's birth kind of completed our family, right? Like kind of made Melbourne in particular feel like home, right? Because my parents had come here pre-internet, back rotary phone days, where it was like, the idea of calling home for them was like $5 a minute, right? And they didn't have money like that. Like that was just obscene. And so, Niki's birth was like, we've got roots here. We've really planted ourselves here. And so she and I were 4 years apart. We grew up, really like, I sometimes talk about it like it's like a conventional Aussie childhood. And then as I reflect on it more that I'm older, I'm like, it wasn't. Like so for instance, we would drive, we'd take Dad's green Mazda station wagon out for like, family day trips and stuff. And we had an Esky. We had this blue Esky, like branded Esky. You got the real, like legit one from Big W, whatever.
Yeah, wow.
but it wasn't filled with like snacks. It was all like chicken tikka masala and stuff. And so we'd get to like picnic stops, and then like other people would come smelling the food, and they'd be like, "Oh, we'll swap you a ham and cheese sandwich
For your food.
We'd be like, "No, man, we're good." But we had so much of it that we just give it away. Like mum would just, it's let's say there's 4 of us, she'd pack enough for like, at least, like a platoon.
Yeah.
And so that was like childhood. We grew up, cricket in summer, footy in winter, Indian background, homework in summer and winter, and every season in between.
Yeah.
And then it was, and life was swell, right? And then, Niki got older, I got older, and when she was 23 in 2015, she tried to break up with her then partner. And things hadn't been working out for her for a while with him. And, there was this kind of background of abuse that we didn't fully comprehend. We didn't fully understand it, to be honest. I think we've made a lot of progress as a society in terms of understanding the issue. But then Niki tried to break up with him. And a lot of women who lose their lives to men's violence lose their life in the context of separation. When they're trying to end the relationship. And so what happens, like at like a fundamental level, is that these men who are violent towards women have this kind of attitude of entitlement, right? They've got this attitude of like ownership over the women that they claim to love, or that they, that they're in relationships with. And so it becomes this thing where, and the man who perpetrated violence against Niki was no different. His final message to her was, well, if you don't want to be with me, then you can't be with anyone. And so he killed her. And that was the beginning of 2015. That was like the 9th of January 2015. And as a family, like I hadn't had time to make, let alone break New Year's resolutions. You start every new year and you're like, oh, I'm going to get fit, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get a new job, whatever it is, I'm going to get into a new relationship. I'm going to sort my life. This is my year, right? I hadn't even gone through those motions yet. And I remember that sometimes so vividly, like it was yesterday, and other times it feels like this kind of strange nightmare that I've got this kind of weird recollection of, and I know it too well, but I don't really know why. And then it kind of jolts me back to reality. And often when we talk about, when you're talking about those 4 women, and we talk about the statistics, like 1 in 4 women from the age of 15 experiencing violence, it's sort of like this strange thing where it's like, wow, that's something that happened to my sister. That's someone that I know, that I grew up side by side with. And then, that's how I sort of came to do this work. That following her murder, I was like, I have the benefit of a university education. My parents moved here, so they, like a lot of migrant families do, so they could give their kids a better life. And then, she lost her life to that violence, and I just thought, fuck, I've got to do something. Like, I've got to say something. I can't just sit there and be quiet.
How sorry to cut in.
Yeah.
How quickly did you come to that thought, like that I got to do something? Like, I mean, I imagine it's such a traumatic event.
Yeah.
Shocking. Like, at what point are you like thinking like that?
For me, it was really quick. For me, it was like, and in the benefit of hindsight, it was too quickly. So like, and I remember this because she died on Friday the 9th of January, and then by the 22nd of February, I'd already written 2 pieces for the newspaper to get like published. So it was like, and that was like 2 weeks after her funeral, because we had to wait for the autopsy and to get the body and do all that. And it was kind of like, it was just running on, I don't want to say adrenaline, because I don't think it was adrenaline, or I don't know what it was, but it was like running on something. I wasn't sleeping. I certainly wasn't like looking after myself. But I just felt this kind of overwhelming sense of injustice that I had to do something, especially because at the time, I remember as soon as the police had left my parents' home, the media was already there, and they had like news cameras stationed outside my parents' house, and You know, my parents had no concept of what was going on. You're in a state of disbelief and shock. Like, you don't actually believe the news. You know, when someone tells you this, because it was two police officers, you know, in their blue uniforms, knocking on the door of my parents' house, 6 a.m. first thing in the morning, and then they were like, "Do you know Niki Chawla?" And then my mum was like, "Yeah, is she okay? What happened?" And then they're like, "I think we should sit down." And then all of a sudden, you know, for a parent, they know that like something bad has happened. And then they told them, my parents, you know, and then my parents told me, and it's just like, my first reaction was like, it's not funny. Like, come on, like don't make jokes like that. And then I tried to call my sister to be like, because we used to prank each other growing up, right? So
how old were you at this point?
What do you mean, 27?
Right.
You know, and
so your parents called you and got you to come over, or you were? My
parents drove to my apartment.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't even know why they were allowed to get behind the wheel of a car. Like that should just not have happened. But they did. They drove to me, and they told me. And I remember it was like 7 a.m, and I woke up to. So my apartment at the time, there used to be like, you know, those apartments where there's like the buzzer on the street, right? And it was like in Richmond, and people could just like walk past after a good night out in town and just press the button.
Just to be a nuisance.
Just to be a nuisance, right? And you almost like drown it out. But then someone kept doing that. And I just remember thinking, oh man, this was going to be my year. It's not my year. And it just kept going and going and going and going. And then I checked my phone. It's like 70 missed calls from my parents. And I'm like, oh, and I didn't know at this point. So I'm just like, this is really annoying. This has ruined my day. Fuck, it did, hey? Like, it was like it's like your kind of expectation of what you think's going to be ruined, and then the reality. And I didn't believe it. At first, I tried to call my sister just thinking, yeah, good one. Like, you got me. All right. Like, you win, you know, this 20-year battle of epic gags. You win. Like, but yeah, it just... Yeah, even now, it sometimes doesn't feel real. I accept it. I know it's reality, but sometimes it just feels weird. And then you do stuff to, like, feel normal. Like, I've still got her in my iPhone kind of favorites. She's still there, right? And every time I, like, update my phone from iCloud, the first thing I do is I check that her number's still in favorites. Even though, like, and I think for, like, 2 years, my dad kept paying, like, her Optus phone bill just so we could keep the number.
Wow.
Just some like weird like trauma response, right?
Well, sorry, what was she like as a person?
Annoying. Yeah. Annoying. What else? No, it's your siblings, right? So like, in fairness, she was the kindest person I've ever known, and in like genuinely kind, like not like Instagram like hashtag kind with sparkle emojis, right? But genuinely like giving of herself, right? Like I remember, you know, I had a party and some of my friends needed a lift home. They couldn't get an Uber, and she like individually drove each of them home because, you know, she didn't drink, or she wasn't drinking then. So it's like, she didn't have to do that. They were my friends. But it's just like one of countless examples. I didn't even know this happened. Like, my friends told me after her death, they were like, oh, you know that time, like, that I couldn't get an Uber. Your sister drove me home. I was like, you live an hour and a half away. And they're like, yeah, she did. You know, and then she wouldn't take money for petrol because she was just like, no, of course, you do it for me. And I was like, no, I wouldn't.
I don't know why the hour and a half really got me. I was like, oh, an hour and a half. That is kind.
That's far, yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah. So if someone to drive you that far, it's like, that's love.
It's huge. Yeah.
So, yeah, no, she was, as a person, she was generous, kind, super creative.
Yeah.
She was involved in like dance and theatre from a really young age. From like the age of 3, she started dancing and then did like Indian classical dancing and stuff. And when she finished high school, she was in two minds. Like, do I pursue what I actually care about, what I love, or do I go for like the safe option, right? And she went for the safe option for 1 year. She studied accounting for a year, and I have never seen a more like categorically depressed, low human being. She changed universities. She started a Bachelor of Performing Arts, and she never got to finish her degree. She had one subject left at the time of her murder, But Monash University very graciously, I say very graciously, but really, like, if someone dies, what are they going to do? So they posthumously awarded her degree. And in 2017, Mum and Dad and myself and some extended family and friends went to, like, Monash University, the hall there, and we got the degree on her behalf. And Mum and I were the two, because they said you can have two people on the stage to accept it. And I felt really, like, it was a really proud moment, because I think that, you know, when we talk about the issue of domestic abuse and violence and education, one of the things about it is gender equality. And, like, globally, particularly, women don't get that right to an education. You know, we see, like, Malala and, you know, the work that she's done for the UN and globally. It's so important, because it's like women have a fundamental right to freedom and education and human rights. So it felt special, you know, for Niki to get that. But then it was also filled with this sense of, like, just massive guilt, right? And I'll tell you why, because when we're getting the certificate, everyone kind of knows the circumstances and the context. So everyone is, like, you know, roaring applause, right? Like standing ovation as Mum kind of, like, held the degree in its frame, like, up above her head, and was, like, really proud moment for Mum. And then they called the next person's name, and the next person was, like, you know, ordinary, regular person, right, who was just getting their degree after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, whatever, of hard work. And they didn't get the same level of applause. And I just felt genuinely sorry for them, because that was the moment that they worked for, but just their surname meant that they were, like, next in line.
Yeah, very hard to follow.
And I was like, man, I feel low-key feel bad for you. Like, is there anything that I can get you to make your day better?
Yeah.
But yeah, really special kind of family moment, you know, to have that. And as a person, all of these great traits around kindness and generosity, and a really creative spirit, but also just straight up fucking annoying, like unbearably annoying, like, and really like caring to a fault. Like, she'd call you and just be like, and you'd be busy, right? Like a day like today, the day we're recording this, I've got other stuff on, like, after this, right? And she'd just call in between and be like, how are you? And it's like, man, I'm busy. That's what I don't have time for this. She'd be like, oh, and how does that make you feel? And it's like, it makes me feel stressed, okay? It makes me feel really stressed. I need to put the phone down now. But I think what I miss about that is that, like, that whole thing about living in the present. And I miss all the stuff that she tried to do, like, to be, you know, like, I'm always like, I've got 100 things on in my mind. Like, we're having this conversation and I'm thinking about, did I leave the iron on at home? Or, like, is the toaster plugged in? Or, you know, am I going to make my flight later? All this stuff, right? She was just there. Like, when you were with her, right, you knew that you were the only person, right? And so, like, and it's weird when it's your sibling that teaches you stuff like that, because you want to hate them. You want to be like, you don't know anything, right? Particularly if you're older than them and you've got that dynamic of older brother, younger sister. And then she's teaching me, like, kind of long term, even though she's gone, this stuff about empathy, kindness, you know, being giving without expecting anything in return. Like, the act of actually just being kind to someone is in and of itself enough. So, I mean, I couldn't sing her praises more highly, Hugh. Like, she was just a genuinely good person.
Yeah, she sounds amazing.
I really wanted to thank you for the beautiful description of Niki and really giving us a picture of Niki, because I feel like often when we refer to women as, mainly women, as victims, suddenly that belittles them again and belittles the structure and that the place that they're in already. So they come out looking for support and all they get is this response that you're a victim. And it continues that power imbalance. So thank you for telling us about who Niki was.
I think there's this thing, right, where, like, whether it's Niki or whoever it is, particularly women who've lost their lives, you know, had their lives taken from them, there's this perception that, you know, particularly in the way the media reports on their death, is that all they were or all they are is a statistic or a victim, but they have whole lives, right? Like, they become known by the, you know, the mode of their death, right? But, you know, they're more than that. You know, like, if someone loses their life to cancer, we don't remember them just because of the cancer. We remember who they were as a person. And I think we could do the same to women who do find themselves as statistics, that they're not just viewed in that way as a victim. And I think it also comes down to the way that we, particularly men, respond, right? Like if a woman discloses abuse or violence, whether institutional or in a domestic setting or in a workplace setting, whatever it is, right? I think we have a duty to believe them.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't, and I think people get really funny about that. They're like, oh, but people lie and some people do lie, right? But what we should do is not disbelieve them immediately. And I think we shouldn't gaslight them straight away. I think what happens straight away is that people say, oh, no, that can't be true. You know what? Tim is a great guy. He would never do that. If that's the default response to a woman disclosing that she's been abused, then what does that say about our society and what does that say about ourselves? If Josh, you said something to me and the first thing I said to you is, no, that can't be true or that's not true, I'm effectively just saying you lied to me.
Yeah, or you have to prove it.
Yeah. And sometimes it's difficult to prove, right?
Of course, yeah.
But that's not enough. That's leave that for the courts, leave that for law enforcement, leave that for someone else, right? In the moment, the most supportive thing we can do is actually just say, like, I believe you and I hear you and I'm here for you. What do you need?
Yeah.
What do you need from me right now?
Yeah.
And there's some of the most powerful words in the English language is just being like, what do you need from me right now? What would help you in this moment? And sometimes for some women, that's all it is just, or men or whoever, right, is just feeling heard, not feeling alone and feeling seen. But too many of us, and I mean, I'm guilty of that, right, is just thinking, oh, no, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wonder if it comes from, it's not always such a bad intent to not believe, that it comes from a position of, oh, this is way too intense for me to deal with, so I'm just going to try and avoid it and shut it down. And in the act of doing that, you're actually gaslighting and continuing the behaviour that they're suffering from.
Because they haven't felt seen or felt heard. So I think this kind of helps to allow that to not be the case. It helps women to feel seen and heard and supported. And that's what they've needed, and the rest of it, the healing journey, for lack of a better term, is long and drawn out, and I think it would be better if more men in particular listen to the voices and stories of women.
Thanks for sharing that. It's
of course.
It gives really great context to, I guess, why you do what you do, but also her as a person, but then also your relationship and it's really special to hear that. So thank you. I guess this being the Academy of Imperfection, what we love with this format is we're sort of here to learn from you. I mean, it's just such one of the worst social problems, most important social problems to get right in Australia and also globally. You touched on a little bit, but why do you think it is so prevalent? Like, what causes this to happen? That's a very big question.
Huge question.
Yeah. Look, there's different schools of thought, in terms of what causes it. And there's no place like home, because we've done this podcast and, over 100 hours of raw audio kind of condensed into just like gems of wisdom from experts and obviously centered around the stories of 10 unique victim survivors. There are some clear patterns around inequality and power and control. And they sort of, they're a theme that every survivor shares, that they were in a relationship where, whether there was physical violence or not, that there was this kind of need to exert dominance and power and control. So there was some survivors for whom there was a lot of financial abuse, like keeping someone on an allowance, like a grown adult person on an allowance and ensuring that they didn't go over that, and monitoring and tracking their movements and whereabouts, never raising, so much as a finger, never leaving a mark, but making this person live kind of in this shell of a human body, like that they were not free to be themselves, to express themselves, to spend time with the people that they wanted to spend time with.
That's a form of control.
Yeah, right? And that's a form of exerting dominance. So when we talk about like emotional abuse, we're not really talking about like the kind of, once-off argument that you might have, right? Conflict happens in even the healthiest of relationships. Conflict itself is just any disagreement, right? It's really about how you handle it. And if one person is like belittling the other person and name calling them, then you could make the argument that they're abusing them, right? But when that becomes a pattern, then it becomes an abusive relationship. And I think it's really important for people to learn that, and know that distinction, that like a once-off kind of argument is not an abusive relationship, right? Because I know a lot of men get worried, right? They're like, oh, am I an abuser? And if they're worried about that behavior, then, there's so many things that they can do to seek help. But at its core, like it's that power and control. And then also because of how much it disproportionately impacts on women, there's gender inequality, and I think that gender inequality kind of manifests in different ways, So we might see it like we see it in politics, for example. There's so few like women leaders elected to positions of power. We see it in business where there's so few kind of women leading, large organizations, boards. We see it in sport, like AFLW gets paid barely anything compared to like AFL, male AFL players. So like across the board, and at home it's like shared division of labor. Like are women expected to just do the housework and that's kind of the role that they play in society. And so there's this whole thing around gender inequality and shifting gender relations, I think, that's both at the core of the problem but at the heart of the solution. And I mean, there are people who think, and we touch on it a little in the podcast, with some experts who think that gender inequality isn't as big a driver, and they think that other factors might be at play. And my argument sort of, particularly as a man, is that like equality isn't going to hurt men. Like if we think about how women are seen as being nurturing, empathetic, caring, and men are seen as like stoic and strong and dominant, that doesn't give us space, I think, as men. I don't think that gives us space to be free and experience the whole range of human emotion. I don't think it's necessarily like we talk about like toxic masculinity, right, Hugh? I don't think it's toxic to have those traits of stoicism, etc. But if that's all that you have, I think that's, and I don't, for some reason I find the term toxic masculinity sometimes limiting. Like I think it's, in its own form, it's like oppressive masculinity, because if you can't experience the full range of human emotion because, of some like unwritten rule about what men and boys are supposed to be, then in its own way, that's oppressing you from being your full self. And so for me, it's like one of the things in recording this podcast was, being conscious of the fact that for everyone listening, and not, for the women, they might have experiences where they can relate directly to what the women are saying because they've been in such relationships, right? Or they're concerned about not getting into such relationships. Whereas for the men listening, it could be that it reminds them of their mum or their sister or someone that they know. Or my hope is that it gives them the impetus to think, well, what kind of man do I want to be? Like, do I want to be in a relationship where this person is terrified of me, right? I may never hit them, but they're terrified of me. And I'm not feeling like I'm living my best self. I'm not living the full range of human emotion. So I think it's really as confronting as the topic is. I think that there's a thread of like hopefully inspiration or something there that's kind of like a nugget of like, hey, I can be more, I can do more.
Yeah. I wonder the role that men can play so men who are not abusive, men who are listening to this right now thinking, well, I'm in a really great relationship and I've never been abusive or controlling. Is there a role that we can all play,
Yeah.
Rather than someone listening out going, shit, he's talking about me. I need to be better. But what about men who are going, well, no, I've never done that, but I do want to be a part of helping this situation.
And even for the men that are listening and they're like, oh shit, he's talking about me, is to acknowledge that we're like, in many ways, we're all like a product of our time, right? Like we, and I'm 35 now, right? I grew up, I remember remember recently, like the Super Bowl halftime show, right? And some of the lyrics in those songs. I grew up on that stuff, right? There's like misogyny embedded in most of those songs.
Oh, big
right?
time. Yeah.
And I grew up on that stuff. So it's not like we can't just say, you know, the worst thing I hate is that now that we know better, that there are some people who are like, oh, I'm holier than thou. I've never thought a bad thing in my life. It's like, bro, really? Like, come on, man. Like, I remember what we were all like, you know, 15, 20 years ago when we were at high school. That's kind of, we thought this was normal.
Yeah.
Even some of the girls that we interacted with thought it was normal because they'd been conditioned into believing stuff. So I think it's, you know, even for the ones that are worried about their behavior in the present day, is to the bravest thing that those men can do is not to beat themselves up like I'm a failure, but to go, I'm someone who needs help. And I'm confident enough in my insecurities to get help for that so that I can have a better relationship fundamentally with themselves, right? But also with the people that they love and their families. And then for everyone else, right, for everyone who listens and is like, well, I'm not abusive, you know, I'm not controlling, I try to be a good person and a good partner, or I want to be a good partner if they're not in a relationship, is understanding kind of the day-to-day experiences of women. You know, like really listening to, you know, like we've seen like Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, so many others kind of speaking out about the experiences that they've had in workplaces, in schools, in kind of day-to-day life. You know, like I'll never forget the first time a woman explained to me the sheer number of steps that she takes to get home from a night out. You know, like literally keeping her keys, you know, in her hand just in case, right? Texting 3 friends, you know, where she's going, who she's with, making sure that her drink is not spiked. Rather than, you know, us as a society going, hey, men, don't spike women's drinks. It's like women are taking the onus on themselves. And so I think it's really important that we kind of have that conversation, the men who aren't abusive, in that context, that like we live in concert with women. And for them, some men's behavior is creating a situation of such fear and apprehension that they're modifying the simplest of acts that a lot of men don't have to do. You know, some men still have to take kind of concerns, but I mean, like, I'm a big dude. I don't really worry when I'm walking down the street. I'm kind of just like, yeah, I'm fine. I don't, you know, I've got my AirPods in, oblivious to the world, listening to another episode of the Imperfects, and it's just like, it's totally fine. Yeah. Like, that was like a product placement inside a product placement.
Yeah. Really smooth.
Which episode?
Dropping the Imperfects in the Imperfects, we appreciate it, but it's not building our audience. That's obviously our main. Yeah, you know.
I clearly don't understand how this process works.
That's all right. I'll send you an email.
Just to sort of what Hugh just said, but I sort of want to paint a scenario and get
Is this
pretty
Josh's
specific.
very good question?
We'll see.
Could be.
I'll let you be the judge if it's a good question or not. To get kind of specific, if I'm in a situation with a group of guys, I'm chatting like my mates or whatever, I know them or I've met some guys, and I feel like I reckon something's not right in that relationship, and I know the guy. I don't think shame is the right way to go because it's just going to push him further down that path. What responsibility do I have as if I'm mate to this guy and I'm concerned?
Yeah.
And then B, what do you do? Like, how do you begin that process? Because I feel like must be a responsibility on us to be the men to try and fix this problem.
Yeah. Okay. So firstly, I just want to say very good question. I think it has to be,
isn't it?
Yeah, like 5 out of 7 question. If you get the reference, you get the. If you don't, you don't. Firstly, right, and I think this has to be said, and it's not talked about enough among men, is don't be a hero that puts yourself into a situation where you also, you know, potentially could get hurt physically.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there is a risk of, you know, men thinking that they need to be the, you know, knight in shining armor. You know, particularly if you're out over drinks, it's a heated situation, and you think, oh, I'm going to step in and fix all of this. Kind of keep your wits about yourself. you don't want to escalate a situation. You always want to de-escalate a situation. I think what you touched on in your question is so important as well around shame, right? Like if you make someone feel less than, then you're not going to get the end outcome that you want, right? They're going to retreat into themselves. They're probably going to go into like those patterns of behavior that they know feel safe to them, which might cause harm to other people, which is exactly what we don't want. And so I think one of the things that you can do in that situation is to remove the person from the behavior. Like don't make it about, say, like, Josh, you are an abusive person, for example, right? It's like, hey, Josh, what happened there wasn't okay. It's not about them, it's about the behavior, right? And oftentimes in the moment, it's about getting out of that situation. Change for this issue isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to happen through incremental steps. And the one thing I always think is so important is to make it about the collective. Like if we're talking about group settings, right, rather than singling out one person and being like, oh, Tarang's like this or Hugh's like that or whatever, just being like, hey, aren't we better than that? Like, aren't we wanting to be a certain type of way?
It's like collective responsibility.
Absolutely. Because it's not about the individual, right? Like if you've got a group of guys and there's one guy whose behavior you're worried about, right, and you just kick him out of the group, he'll find another group, right? And if that's your first port of kind of call to like fix the issue is just get rid of him. He's not going to learn anything from that. You're not going to, you're not really helping the situation.
Well, and it's almost a selfish act, really, to kind of like just push the problem into another place as opposed to.
Yeah. And it makes it seem like they're solely the problem. Like there's nothing in our group that has made it that it's been okay for them to behave that way. I think it's kind of, if we examine our own kind of entitlements and privileges and then we go, oh, maybe we've created an environment here where he thinks it's okay to, belittle women or demean women or treat women in a certain way. What is it about this group? What can we do differently? Should we have a conversation with him? What's the best way to approach this? And I think that a lot of us as blokes don't have that conversation. Like we don't have it at all. We're just like, oh, he's a problem, or more commonly than saying he's a problem is actually just diminishing it entirely. Just being like, oh, that's just the way he is,
Yeah.
That's just the way Tim is. Oh, it's fine. He's always been like that. He doesn't mean anything by it. And it's like, but maybe he does, And sorry to any Tims out there, but like Tim's kind of like, let's say he's making a sexist joke every time we catch up, right? And then it's like, after a while, it's like, I don't know if that's okay anymore. And the thing is, right, that not all sexism or disrespect of women is going to end in like, the way my sister lost her life, being stabbed to death. It's not going to, that's not how it's, that link is not like it's a clear straight line, right? But it's a continuum. And so especially for women, they don't know, if the guy that's making sexist jokes at the pub is the same guy that's going to potentially use physical violence in the home, right? They actually don't know because no abusers have it written on their foreheads. So I think, as a society, the more that we have that collective responsibility, like you touched on, Ryan, the more that we kind of look out for one another, because this has been, as an issue, we've sort of treated it like we'll just keep it behind closed doors. It's just a domestic. It's none of our business.
Yeah.
But if we see something and we walk past it, then we're just saying that that's okay.
Yeah.
And I would have hoped that if someone knew, what Niki was going through, that they'd have done something, that they'd have said something.
Yeah.
And it's, and Niki's just one face. There's so many stories and faces and annoying siblings, right? There's just so many people that are impacted by the issue that I think we have this responsibility. And for me, that was one of the reasons, Hugh, I think, for doing this podcast was that we don't hear from these people who have survived nearly enough. We'll sometimes hear from experts when there's like a news grab or the latest, woman becomes a statistic. We'll hear something, right? But how often do we actually get an opportunity to sit down in their own words and listen to them talk about what they went through, what they've learned, and what would have actually helped them? You know, and that's where I think the rest of us as guys step in to be like, hey, well, that's not that hard. We can do that. You know, like we can support a mate to get help if he's got problems with his behavior or his behavior is causing issues in his family. You know, or for ourselves, and be like, hey, we could get help. We could talk to a therapist. We go to some, behavior change or anger management or whatever it is to really kind of become the best versions of ourselves.
Just to go back to Josh's question, I'm just thinking about practically how it'd play out. Say you're sitting around at a pub with those like 7 or 8 guys and it's quite raucous and everyone's drinking beers and then someone says something really sexist. I feel like not many men... Maybe it's. I just feel like not many men would go, "Hey, that's not okay," across the table.
Yeah.
And then I'm just wondering, is there another way of approaching it where, like, you note that and go, "I need to chat to them at some point."
The one thing that resonated with me, I'm just imagining this scenario, and I'm thinking about my own group of mates, and yes, those kind of jokes is one area, and then I'm just thinking of behaviours that are not okay that we've kind of grown out of as a group of blokes. I do feel like the collective responsibility thing really resonated with me when now there's a general feeling of like we're not the kind of guys who do that, and it's almost spoken like we're better than that,
right? Yeah,
or we're better than that as a group. And I don't know how that began. I'm trying to remember whether it was the kind of like, because every group has a kind of alpha in the group who kind of sets the tone, or a couple of them.
So you feel like there was a point where your
like
mates went from being schoolboys who just sort of learned this stuff through just environment.
Products of Dr. Dre-esque.
Well, that's a good example.
Time,
that kind of, and grew out of being little boys basically who said stupid shit.
Yeah. I mean, I still listen to that stuff. Like that Super Bowl halftime show was like one of the greatest days of my life.
Yeah, and apologies to Dre if you're listening.
But no, I'm just trying to remember if it offers anything. But just now I know that if people do things that are unacceptable in that way, or like talk about girls like that, there was a moment where, like, as a collective, they'll be like, "Oh, we're better than that.
Yeah,
come on, let's lift which didn't used to be there." And I can't. I wish I knew the moment where that shifted.
Yeah. Well, I found that thing happening, Josh, in group chats. I found group chats kind of like,
that's true.
Like your WhatsApp group chat. Someone will say something, and there's like. There's this thing that we often as men approach like, oh, how would I know if something's bad or not? I think we know.
Well, we definitely know now.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us, we know now, as you say, Ryan, and we kind of, it's that like collective groan, like, oh, like, it's like you're at a comedy show and someone says, the comedian makes a gag that's clearly just like designed to offend. There's nothing clever behind it. There's no incisive, social commentary. It's just designed to cause kind of hurt, right? And then you're like, oh, I don't know. Yeah. And so we kind of had that in our day-to-day life, right? And there's, on the one hand, it's like collective responsibility and we're better than that. And on the other hand, Hugh, when sometimes you don't know what to do, right? You don't know how to have that conversation, particularly in the moment. And in those kind of things, in those kind of situations, one of the most practical things is to not laugh along with the joke.
Yeah.
Right? Like if someone makes a joke that is sexist or racist or, derogatory or homophobic, whatever it is, right? Then asking them, hey, what do you mean? Right? Really deadpan, really flat. Give it a second and then just go, hey, Ryan, what do you mean? And all of a sudden watching the wheels turn in their head having to explain how it's not sexist, right? Is enough for them to be like, I'm never making that gag again. And you don't even need to necessarily have that conversation with them. And the other is that, like, in a group setting, like you said, raucous at the pub over beers, that's not going to be the site of, the most meaningful conversation.
We're not going to crack the case here.
Yeah. So take it out of that context, follow up with them afterwards, right? Just park it.
Yeah.
I've been out, right, and something's happened. And I've literally pulled my phone out and just written in notes, like what I remember, And it's like, and then and then afterwards it's just like, bring it up in like 3 days or whatever. It's like, hey, you remember when we were at the pub? I didn't understand what you were saying when you made that joke, but I remember Claire felt uncomfortable and I don't know, like Have you checked in? Is she okay? And then it's like, hang on. And then sometimes you learn that, hey, it wasn't intentional, right? They didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. They didn't mean to make this joke that was disrespectful. But like I said, we're the product of our environments, right? So we're all on different paths along that journey. Because what you said, Josh, I wholeheartedly agree with. That whole idea of like shaming men or shaming us for a mere existence, it's not going to help. We're 50% of the population, right? Like we're here for the long haul.
It also seems like a practical thing in that I'm not an expert, but from my amateur understanding of the issue, it seems like domestic violence must stem from a desire to hold power over someone. And if you're taking away power from a male in front of a group of men, then who's likely to perpetrate domestic violence feels like they're just going to try and seek power somewhere else. So if I shames a guy and he feels belittled, then when he's in a situation where he can hold power over someone, it's just going to increase the chance of him doing it more.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in that either.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I don't think I'm an expert in anything, frankly, but I think that I think that one of the things, it's a wrong guest for the wrong podcast. No, I think one of the things about that though is part of the human condition is that like shame and negative reinforcement might work once, maybe twice, maybe a handful of times, but after that it loses effectiveness pretty quickly.
Yeah.
You know, like it's like training a pet, right? Like when I got a dog and like if I just got angry at her, right, with negative reinforcement, it did nothing. When positive reinforcement, she's like the most well-behaved dog, right? So it's like, it's the same thing with like human behavior is not that dissimilar, right? That like we kind of, if we reinforce the kinds of things that we want to see in men. And I think that's where like whenever I see a sports person, a respected sports person talking about mental health or domestic abuse or family violence or an issue that whether it's been close to their heart because they grew up in a home where violence was the norm or they've, battled their own mental illness and mental health kind of issues, I really respect that because I think as other men, we look to that, right? We look to that for guidance. We look to that for solace. And we kind of like, it's like, hey, they might be an elite sports person or they might be amazing at whatever they do in their vocation, but they're just like us, and I think it really humanizes the issue.
Yeah.
So it's like the more men that just talk about this openly, the healthier this whole space is going to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it helps people, particularly helps in the sense that women understand then that they're not alone.
Yeah.
The very act of men going and listening to There's No Place Like Home, I think, is a revolutionary act given that men don't tend to engage with this content at all. And I'm like, and I have to be honest, like hand on heart, I am a part of that, right? Like until my sister was murdered, I wouldn't have written about this issue. Yeah. I obviously cared. I'd be like the three of you. I'd be like, what can I do? But it wasn't until, and I have to be honest about that, it wasn't until Niki was murdered that I was like, whoa, I'm going to actively do something, like really put myself out there. But I think we're at a time now where not enough of us are having that conversation around gender inequality.
Yeah.
And it's showing.
I 100% agree. One thing that you do talk about in that first episode of your podcast, There's No Place Like Home, is something that it kind of plays into what you're talking about, Josh, with like a group of guys, but the more common place is the domestic partnership, and that's gaslighting. And the whole act of gaslighting is we hear it said a lot and it's done a lot, and especially like it just made me think it can even happen in a group of male friends. If someone's approached, then the guy can very easily just choose to gaslight and tell them, what are you talking about? Like, just make them feel crazy or stupid or annoying for bringing it up or petty. But can you please explain gaslighting? I mean, I thought the way that you explained it in the podcast was really, really helpful.
And also the origins.
Yeah. So, I mean, it comes from like a 1930s stage play, right? The term gaslighting, where the male kind of protagonist keeps changing the lighting, of a room or a space, and then
like literally the gas light.
Yeah, literally the gas light.
Yeah.
And then the woman keeps questioning, like, is it dimmer? Is it brighter? It feels lighter. It feels darker. And he keeps telling her, reassuring her that it's not. And eventually, progressively, she kind of loses her mind and goes crazy. And that's the origins of the term. So it's making someone question their own reality.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a tricky term because it's sometimes misused or misappropriated. A lot of people will just use it like, if you disagree on something, then it's automatically gaslighting. Well, that's not really what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's more a pattern of like, you say you have conflict, like any healthy relationship will have some level of conflict and disagreement, right? So you disagree on something and then you say something, let's say I said something to you, Ryan, and then you tell me back what I said. And then I'm like, no, I didn't say that. So you deny and you minimize, and you outright lie, or you like kind of like avoid going to the truth of the situation of what happened. And over time, the other person questions their recollection of events. They question their version of reality. And what it does is it wears down someone's self-esteem. So it makes it easier to emotionally abuse and to control. I mean, in its own right, it's a form of emotional abuse. But what's most sinister about it is that you can't see it, right? Because you can't see it. You can't go to someone could you imagine if someone was like, hey, I've been abused, and then it was like, well, what happened? And they're like, well, it made me question my own reality.
Yeah.
Right? You'd go, oh, well, that doesn't even make sense. Are you crazy? Like maybe they're genuine. But when you you meet these people, right? You meet these women who they've been in decade-long relationships, some of them, and it started really small. It started really, really small. And then it built up over time, the behaviors, so that they would question whole things about their relationship. And then they would end up being so victimized, and so lacking in self-esteem and self-worth that they almost, really sadly legitimized their own abuse. Like they, and they should never have been put in that situation, right? It wasn't their fault at all. But they started to feel like maybe I do deserve this. And that's so heartbreaking. Like for me to sit across from someone and hear from them that they thought they deserved to have suffered, or their children, what was happening to their children or what was being done to their children was somehow their fault, when it's the father of the children who's abusing them, was like, that's not your fault. Like that's a choice that someone is making. And so gaslighting, coercive control, we touch on in the series as well. These kinds of non-physical forms of abuse. And I think it's important we talk about them.
Coercive control really interests me. I've been reading a bit about it recently. And I feel like it would be a lot more common than the statistics would report.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people wouldn't know that's what's happening to them.
A lot of people don't. And a lot of people from particular communities as well, like when it comes to like, I'm from like South Asian Indian background. When you talk about other kind of culturally diverse communities, stuff like that, there is this lack of understanding around control because there is this rigid kind of adherence to men as the head of the family, right? And so if they're doing anything that, we might look at as controlling, for them it's normal. For even some of the people in the relationship, the children or the female partner, the wife, whoever it may be, it's normal, right? So it's really kind of tricky. And I think
could we define coercive control as well as we defined gaslighting? Because I found that definition is really
just
helpful.
The reason I had someone contact me the other day, it was a male contact me and said, I believe I'm trapped in a coercive relationship, and I've looked up all the I just tick every box here of it was everything except for one of the things is violence. He said, obviously she's not violent with me, but everything else.
Yeah, and I mean that speaks to the whole thing that like men can be victims of abuse too and violence too. And I think it's really important to put things in context around the fact that men are victims too. And I think some of the frameworks of how we view violence don't support this understanding that that men who are victims also deserve help. Because of that whole shame thing about like, oh, what kind of man would let it happen to them type thing. But when it comes to like coercive control, one of the issues is that the experts don't fully agree on definitions, right? They're not like, so there was this, in 2019, Scotland criminalised coercive control, and they had a set of laws there around, and then training for law enforcement around what that would look like. And essentially at its core, it was like any behaviour that was designed to control and diminish another person's sense of agency. So like tracking someone's movements, controlling who they're allowed to spend time with. So, for example, my sister Niki wasn't allowed to spend time with her family, us.
Yeah, this is exactly what that guy told me as well. Yeah. He can't see his family anymore.
Yeah, like we would just be like, she's not spending as much time with us. And we were like, maybe she's happy. Or maybe it's a good thing. Initially. But then it was like she would miss like important family trips. She'd become so reserved around us. And it was because she'd go home and then, she would hear it or feel it, it'd hit her. And so like I think one of the things around coercive control is this understanding that it's any pattern of behavior that's designed to control another person.
Financial control, I think.
Financial control is another one. Emotional, psychological. Spiritual abuse is one that we don't touch on sometimes, where it's like if what person of faith, and then they're not allowed to practice their religion or whatever they believe in, which can have such devastating consequences for that person in terms of their emotional well-being, their connection to their community.
And that would be a really big one in like splitting up families as well.
Oh, huge, yeah. And I think the issue in Australia with coercive control is, and I'm not fully decided which side of the fence I sit on as well with this, is that I think there needs to be education around what it is and awareness around what it is, and then measures to combat coercive control. I'm always reluctant to be of the view that more laws equals less harm. Like that whole thing around like, well, people know that murder is wrong. Like there are laws against murder. There are laws against sexual violence, rape, assault. Doesn't stop people doing it. Doesn't stop, regardless of the gender of the victim, men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of physical violence outside of the home. Like when we talk about like coward punches or king hits, whatever they're being called, or we talk about, sexual violence towards women in the community, men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators. There are laws against that. And I just think that they've been there since forever, right? Like these are like laws against rape, all that stuff. They're not new, right? We've had them for some time, but it doesn't stop people doing it. It doesn't stop men doing it. So I think that all of a sudden just saying we've criminalized coercive control may not necessarily lead to men going, oh, well, I'm not going to be controlling anymore. Yeah. Great.
And so if we do that, obviously the other end is education.
Yeah.
What would you love to – I mean, I'm just listening to you speak now. We got – so many kids around Australia doing our curriculum at the moment, which is around mental health. But I'm wondering, what would you love to put into? I'm thinking a secondary school. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about like there should be some kind of relationships, like education around what a healthy relationship looks like, and the signs that it's not healthy, and what you do in that situation.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you think you would love to see in schools?
Yeah, I think consent education, which is something that's going to be happening in a couple of years from now, is really important. But it's really just the start. Yeah. I think that respectful relationships has to be in context, right? Like we often, and I think this around like boys and men, is we often talk about boys' mental health, right? Which is essential, which we must do. And I think we should do it in the context of how, mental ill health for boys has ramifications beyond the individual. It's that collective responsibility, right? That like whether it's harm, to the, whether it's, whenever we hear about another tragic suicide, right? The ripple effects of that in the family and the community are vast. And I think that the same kind of understanding around domestic abuse would really help. That if we had an education that prioritizes respectful relationships, that prioritizes gender inequality, and really supports kind of holistic raising of boys and girls, we'd lead to more like well-rounded men. We'd allow women to reach their potential. We'd see more women in positions of leadership. We'd see more women in positions of power. We'd obviously feel all the kind of economic and other benefits as a society. But we'd also have happier men. You know, like I've done a lot of work in workplaces, Hugh, and one of the things around gender inequality that a lot of the men talk to me about, those with young children especially, is that the expectation that they are permanently working, you know, even when they're at home, like bringing work from home and stuff, is like, I don't get to spend time with my kids. You know, and equality would mean that there is a workplace that's working for carers, you know, so that men could also take on some of that responsibility. And it's normal. You know, if they're like, hey, I'm clocking off early today because I got my, you know, kids' soccer practice, it's not like, oh, well, you have to choose between that or having a job here. You just be like, oh, yeah, cool. No worries. See you tomorrow.
I know where sort of time is an issue. I wonder whether it would be, unless there's something else you guys wanted to.
I had one question.
I also had a question, but you go first.
Yeah, was anyone else, when you were defining coercive control and gaslighting, I guess less so with gaslighting, but was everyone else thinking of people that they know that you're like, shit, I think I know people in relationships like that?
Yeah.
Or was that just me?
Oh, yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wonder, like, I just feel like they're having this discussion, like these discussions just, the more, that feels like a huge step. Because because I wasn't picking up on some of this stuff and thinking, oh, actually, no, I know some people in those relationships, and I now feel like, oh, okay, now I've got to talk more about this. So the definitions and the terms and the behaviours become more prevalent. Like we know the tell signs of like problem drinking or problem gambling or things like that, but these initial signs, I think, just so we can all pick up on them quicker would be huge.
And I think one of the things right around this is that like the collective responsibility thing is so important, right, as part of the puzzle. But then also that kind of like self-awareness and self-reflection is so important, right? Like if we have, and easier said than done, right? Like way easier said than done. But if we try to, because wait times are exceedingly long, but if we can get in to see someone, you know, talk to them about what's going on for us. And it doesn't always have to be a therapist. Some people go to like their faith-based settings, or they like speak to someone in their like footy club or whatever, that kind of like older, trusted, respectful male figure, to really develop and understand ourselves, right? And what might be an issue, you know, in ourselves or what we're worried about. We actually build healthier male to male peer relationships as a result, and our communities benefit, and our family units benefit. So it's like, it's kind of, it's tricky and nebulous because it's not just one thing. You know, on the one hand, it's like the group chat and being at the pub and knowing when to intervene safely and being, you know, cognizant and aware of other people's behavior. But on the other, it's really about who are we? You know, what kind of man do I want to be? And in constantly trying to improve and looking after ourselves as well in the process.
I mean, with the statistics that you were talking about and Hugh you were talking about, there's no doubt there are people listening right now who are either perpetrator, whether it's coercive control or some sort of control or abuse, or a victim of some way, or someone who at least knows a victim. What advice, I guess, or guidance could you give to both parties?
Yeah.
Who are currently in that situation, and I mean, particularly for the victim, it's like, what can you do?
Because I can't help but think about women who listen, their hearts are racing, right?
Just
going, this is me.
And you know what? That makes me think, Hugh, and it's in the question, right? It's in Ryan's question, I think. The answer lies right there. You know, for the women that hear this and their hearts racing, wouldn't it be great if we had as men the same degree of empathy, you know, that our hearts are racing like, shit, like that could be someone that, you know, that I know. That could be one of the girls, you know, in our group. And then, you know, in your question, Ryan, is that like, what advice do I have? Or you know, the only words I would have is that they're not alone. You know, that like if we all know someone, right, or we're personally affected, then we're not alone. And for too long, it's been that kind of thing that's just in the shadows, right? Like domestic abuse, it's in the name, so it must be a home issue, doesn't affect us. But that's bullshit, because it's like, if someone is living through coercive control at home, then imagine what impact that's having on every other aspect of their life, right? So it's really that whole thing of that whether you're worried about your behavior, or, you know, you're in a relationship where someone else's behavior is affecting you, you're not alone. So there's no shame either way in seeking help, especially for those who are worried about their behavior. I think one of the most kind of noble things you can do is actually put your hand up and go, hey, I think I have a problem. You know, I actually don't think what I'm doing is okay, and I want to stop. You know, that genuine feeling, you know, of self-improvement. Because otherwise what? You do something horrible and then you have to go before a judge and show remorse.
So well then, two things, I guess, practically speaking, in this moment, as whoever's listening is listening, what, like I know in that first episode of your podcast you mentioned, is it 1-800-RESPECT?
1-800-RESPECT.
So that's the number for a victim to call.
That's a number for anyone to call. So
okay.
1-800-RESPECT is the National Domestic and Sexual Violence hotline. Women can call it. Women often do. Men can call it if they're worried about their behaviour.
Okay.
And you know, then they can link you to support services in your area. If you're worried about, you know, having to speak in English because English isn't the language that you know, that comes naturally to you, then they've got interpreters. They've got access to stuff. It's 24 hours. It's the kind of thing that, like, you know, you want to pick up the phone and get help for.
And is that something? And I'm just trying to make this process as easy and clear for whoever's listening as possible. If a perpetrator did call 1-800-RESPECT, I imagine that their initial fear is like, I'm going to be dobbed on, or I'm going to be.
No, that's not what they're there for. No, they're not. They're not the police. You know. They obviously they have some guidelines like any healthcare professional that if they're worried, you know, genuinely worried about self-harm or harm to another person. So if you, like, you know, hypothetically someone calls 1-800-RESPECT, so I'm going to kill someone, then it's like, then they're all of a sudden they're like, well, we have a clear indication of intent. But otherwise, you know, they're there to help. They're there to go, okay, so, you know, let's say I called up and said, I'm worried about my behavior. They'd go, well, what are you worried about? What, you know, tell me about what are the patterns of behavior that you think are the issue? And they kind of talk you through it before they get to a point of going, okay, well, these are the support services that would probably benefit you.
Amazing.
And I think that if more of us, like I said, picked up the phone and actually took those steps, we'd have better relationships. Like, you see the other side of this where men who have gone through the therapy and the counselling and the behaviour change and are doing the work, you know, they're at a point where they're having more fulfilling relationships, you know, particularly with their children. Oftentimes the relationship with the ex-partner, that'll never be repaired right after the abuse and the violence. But at least they can have a meaningful relationship with their kids. And I know for a lot of men that's important, you know, like that's contributing to their own well-being. And you know, the alternative is to not have that, and potentially, you know, some people end up in jail, and that doesn't help them, let alone anyone else. So I think it's really about kind of making the best of a situation.
Yeah. So 1-800-RESPECT is the number that people know. I wouldn't know how to do the letters now.
Yeah, 736 732. But yeah,
there you go. Well, it says the letters on the numbers. on your phone.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I can't get this out of my mind. So I just want to finish the interview with this. How are your parents now?
Yeah, wow. Niki and I are very lucky. I'm very lucky. Like, I couldn't do any of the advocacy work that I've done in the 7 years since Niki's murder if I had a different set of parents. Firstly, because I was raised in a house where, like, gender equality was the norm. You know, my dad's a really kind of just a genuinely good dude. Like, if I can become half the man, where he's now double the age that I am, if I could become half the man that my dad is when I'm his age, I'll have clocked life. Like, he's just a genuinely good human being. But I mean, Hugh, they're well as you can be. Like, sometimes mum cries, you know, there are occasions like the 21st of June is when, you know, my sister's birthday is. She would have turned 30 in 2021. That was a sad day, you know, like for them and for me, like seeing like what could have been, you know, like as much as I've lost a sibling, Niki's lost her life, man. Like, you know, she's lost the opportunity for her as well, being a creative. She's lost the opportunity to create, you know, like that was the sole reason that she existed, right? And so mum and dad are, you know, they're looking after themselves. They're keeping well. And they've handled, particularly mum, with a kind of like a quiet dignity and grace that I think is really admirable.
Are they different people now? Do you feel like it's changed them enormously?
Yeah, probably. I mean, like the core sense of self is still there, But trauma changes anyone, whether it's loss or, through murder or cancer or whatever it is, like trauma changes someone. So, they're probably different, but I'm different as well, right? So how would I know? How would I be able to say that they are this way versus the way they were before? Because the way I perceive the world has changed, right? Like I'm very much like, my attitude is just like, you want to do something, just give it a go. Because I never thought that what happened to Niki was within the realm of possibility. And so for me now, if I'm doing something and there's this perception that like, oh, it's impossible or, it's too bold an undertaking, I'm like, well, something that I thought was impossible happened. Mm-hmm. Something so negative that I thought was impossible happened. So the flip side of that could, in an alternate reality also be true. So why not just give it a go and see what happens? So I think it's changed me, and I think it's changed my parents as well. Yeah.
I want to look at the records for who won the who actually won Young Australian of the Year in 2017. Because that must have been bloody impressive to beat you, I have to say.
Yeah, no, I don't know actually. It's a good question. But yeah, no, I mean accolades and stuff is nice, but ultimately for me, like the idea of I grew up in a safe home, right? I just want that for everyone else.
Yeah.
Because that gives people the opportunity to be whoever they want to be. And I think that's the main thing.
You've given us so much to go away and think about, and all the listeners, I feel so grateful. I've been enthralled listening to you speak.
Yeah. Thank you, Tarang.
No, thanks for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love how you do this around the table.
Thank you, Tarang.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If this episode has been triggering for you, we strongly recommend Lifeline on 131114. The Imperfects is hosted and co-produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Brian Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. This episode was produced by Bridget Northeast, edited by Andy Hall, filmed by Andy Poole and social mediaed by George Martin. A special thanks to Dr. M for her expertise and guidance. We'd also like to thank the Resilience Project for their ongoing support. Our acknowledgement of country was delivered by Marley Silva, and you can find Marley's podcast Chicks and Balls on all the podcast platforms.